Ladies and gentlemen, young and old.
The Ten Commandments is the culmination of DeMille. It's the movie he'd been moving slowly towards throughout his career.
It changed the course of a lot of things, including to a certain degree Hollywood history. Ten Commandments became the quintessential epic film and the quintessential C.B. DeMille film. When you think C.B. DeMille, you think Ten Commandments. He got to make it twice, after all.
One of the most important things to DeMille was his audience. He respected them.
In so many ways, Cecil B. DeMille was the real McCoy and probably the best representative and best champion of the motion picture industry that there was.
He was making Bible stories real. He was taking my Sunday school lessons and putting faces and emotions to them.
This is the necklace that I wore in the Ten Commandments. It's an emotional experience.
Mr. DeMille, he was an extraordinary man to work for.
DeMille used to say, this is a movie that's going to live beyond me and you and everyone else. This is a movie that's going to be seen all over the world, and it's universal.
Moses is one of the world's greatest human beings, and holy to the point of seeing God and receiving from him the law, by which men may live in peace and freedom. The Ten Commandments.
DeMille, as far as Dad went, invented the film industry as we know it. He came out to Hollywood in something like 1913 to make The Squaw Man with a couple of guys named Samuel Goldfish, a.k.a. Sam Goldwyn, and Jesse Lasky, and they came here when it was just frontier, really.
Paramount was home for DeMille. He was one of the founders of Paramount. Learning the stories of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, from his father as a young man, led him in later years, when he could afford it, to tell those stories on film. The first Ten Commandments was both modern and biblical.
The Ten Commandments, I think he thought of as a missed opportunity. He realized that when he looked at the picture again, the second part of the picture is the part that doesn't really quite work. And I think he realized that he might think about expanding the biblical prologue and just doing the whole hog version of the Ten Commandments, a strictly biblical story.
By the early 1950s, Cecil B. DeMille had proven himself to Paramount Pictures and to Adolph Zukor. Adolph Zukor was the corporate umbrella of Paramount Pictures. The relationship between DeMille and Zukor was a progressively uneasy one. And in spite of the tremendous success of Samson and Delilah, by DeMille's own admission, there was still suspicion about how a religious subject would fare at the box office.
You are the chosen one. I know nothing of your God.
Paramount was frightened because there was no budget. It was simply uncharted territory in terms of special effects. Not only that, DeMille wanted to shoot a lot of location work in Egypt.
But he was in as good a position by the time he made the Ten Commandments, or perhaps much better position in his career than he had ever been.
It's a motion picture for everyone, with a heart and a sense of humor.
He was an award-winning filmmaker, having finally gotten the Best Picture for The Greatest Show on Earth and the Irving Thalberg Memorial Award. DeMille was at his zenith.
You know, they had great faith in DeMille, and when he told them the story, they believed in it, and they believed in him. It was a tremendous risk, but because of him, they took it.
As many of you know, the Holy Bible omits some 30 years of Moses' life.
The story, of course, comes from the Bible. There's not a book in the world that has more drama than the Bible. You don't have to go hunting for it, it's there. But what he did have to hunt for, of course, was the missing years and the love that Nefertiti had for him and the rivalry between Ramses and Moses.
To fill in those missing years, we turn to ancient historians such as Philo and Josephus.
Henry Nordlinger was his research guy, a Swiss who'd been at MGM. Nordlinger started plowing through not biblical sources, but sources that derive from 300 years, 500 years, 1,000 years after the events described in the Bible, to come up with some semblance of a narrative for those missing 30 years.
He had many screenwriters and research assistants on the Ten Commandments. All of these ideas, all of this story construction, and all of these characterizations of Moses went into a final, coherent motion picture story to present to the public.
DeMille always said that he made his movies at his desk. What he meant was that the preparation was so tremendous, and you could take as long as you wanted to prepare for a movie because it was the cheapest part of making that movie was preparation.
If there was anyone outside of DeMille who was responsible for the way the Ten Commandments looks and is, it's Henry Wilcoxon. He was truly Mr. DeMille's right hand. He would be in makeup and shoot a scene in the day, and then by the afternoon he would be back being associate producer.
The reason Henry Wilcoxon was his associate producer was he could paint and he could draw. Henry would sit in the commissary next to DeMille, and they would be discussing what somebody would wear, the kind of background, the props, that sort of thing.
I remember going to the commissary every day and looking at Mr. DeMille at his amazing table where he sat in the middle, and Henry Wilcoxon and Henry Nordlinger and all of his people were all around him. And there was the gigantic Holy Bible that was on the table, so you could look things up.
Then after Henry had made a sketch, they would call in either Johnny Jensen, William Majors. In the case of the Ten Commandments, they hired Arnold Freeberg for the run of the movie, and they would realize in oils and watercolors the costumes, the headdresses, the jewelry, the shoes, all of those things that you see in a DeMille movie.
Norma Desmond is coming in to see you, Mr. DeMille.
Norma Desmond?
She must be 1,000,000 years old.
I hate to think where that puts me. I could be her father.
Very sorry.
Mr. DeMille was an actor. He had started out on the stage in New York. Both he and his brother began acting and directing their own things on the stage. So, as a result, he loved his actors.
I, of course, worked first for Mr. DeMille in Greatest Show, which was an enormous break for me. And I don't really know why he cast me. I was driving off the lot one day, having finished my first film, and he was standing on his front steps there with a group of his people. And I had met DeMille. Everyone met DeMille. Every new actor, you would have coffee with him in his dining room. So there he was. So as I drove by in a convertible with the top down, I waved at him, and he nodded back. I was told afterwards that he turned to his secretary, who did not really take down every word he said, but she knew what to take down. And he said, "Who was that?" And she looked in her book, and she said, he's a Broadway actor. His name's Charlton Heston. He did just finished a picture for Hal Wallace. You ran it 10 days ago. You didn't like it. And he said, "I like the way he looked just now. Let's have him in to talk about the circus picture." Bingo.
Ten Commandments was the talk of the town. I think there were a lot of actors who were up for it. As Dad said, he had to get in line.
Henry sat up one night, and he was going through all of his art books, and he came across Michelangelo's statue of Moses, and he said, "Oh my God, it looks just like Chuck Heston." And so he said, "I think Charlton Heston would be a great Moses."
Here is a photograph of the original statue in Rome. Notice the likeness to Charlton Heston, who plays Moses in the Ten Commandments.
Dad used to blame his nose on the fact that he got the part. He said he had a broken nose he got playing football at New Trier High School. And if you look at the wonderful Michelangelo sculpture of Moses in the chapel in Rome, it's just fantastic, magnificent. It's the quintessential Moses. That statue was in a replica, a small one, was in DeMille's office. And DeMille called him and said he'd like to meet with him. He didn't send him the script. He didn't tell him what part he was up for. He went in and met with DeMille, and they talked about various things. But as Dad said, there wasn't much he could say because he hadn't read the script. You'd never get to read a script. And he just listened and said, well, Mr. DeMille, that sounds like a magnificent project, and I'd be thrilled to be any part of it. And a little time goes by, and he gets a call back. Still no script. Still he doesn't know what role. Meantime, Dad uses the opportunity to do his research. He reads Breasted's History of Egypt, he reads the Old Testament, he reads everything he can get his hands on. And at least then he can talk with some knowledge and passion. And this time DeMille showed him elaborate little drawings and big paintings that he'd done and models that had moving pieces in it of the various sets that he had planned. You could tell he was really enthusiastic. DeMille had a passion for this. And I think some of that sort of rubbed off on Dad. So eventually, he did get the part, as Dad likes to say, by a nose. Ten Commandments had an astonishing cast.
The deliverer is Moses.
When you consider Edward G. Robinson, who was one of the greatest movie stars of all time.
So let it be written. So let it be done.
And of course, Yul Brynner, who played this magnificent kind of haughty, sneering Ramses.
I was with Grandfather. He said, let's go back to New York. There's an actor I want to see there. So we hopped on the train, went to New York, and went to see The King and I. And in intermission, we went back to see Yul, and Grandfather walked in, and he said, Mr. Brynner, how would you like to play the world's most powerful man? And Yul said, well, Mr. DeMille, I'd like that very much. We had to save the part for him because he was booked for The King and I. We had to wait till that had its run.
Is God.
And Yul brought a presence that Grandfather saw, of course, in The King and I, this dynamic ruler who was vulnerable. And he used that very well.
General of generals, commander of the Egyptian host, a man of mud.
A lot of people say Anne Baxter was over the top. For its time, that was appropriate drama.
Who else can soften Pharaoh's heart?
He wanted either Grace Kelly or Audrey Hepburn. Grace Kelly could not be loaned out from MGM. They would not loan her out. So that left Audrey Hepburn, but the problem was that her figure was not the classical Egyptian figure that we see on the walls and in the paintings.
Oh, Moses. Moses. Oh, Moses. Moses.
Anne Baxter, well, first of all, she's a wonderful lady. She was a very, very nice person. She brought to the role, I would never change it because it was so successful, but it was almost campy.
This is for my wedding night.
Because you wouldn't think of an Egyptian queen being like that.
I'm surprised you noticed me.
And yet, she was very human, especially when Grandfather showed the romance between the Ethiopian and Moses.
And such a beautiful enemy.
And you see Anne Baxter, who's very jealous of this beautiful woman, going like this, and it's very human. She made a lot of that very difficult role human.
Marry her if you can, my son, but never fall in love with her. Oh.
Nina Foch is someone that probably most people would not have chosen. And yet, the part, to her, must have seemed a golden one.
Would you undo all that I have done for him? I have put the throne of Egypt within his reach.
To be able to have that wonderful confrontation with Moses' mother, played by Martha Scott, that is played out so beautifully, and there's so much pathos.
What can you give him in its place?
I gave him life.
Martha Scott played Dad's mom 2 times, both in Ben-Hur and in Ten Commandments, and they were in 2 plays together as well. Dad said the plays were flops, but the films were pretty big hits.
Everybody gets a moment. But by casting an actress like Judith Anderson, it's not just a name. There's a reason she's Judith Anderson. She's got that power.
You prepare for a marriage that will never be.
She compels attention. And even in a small part where she doesn't have that much to do, except motivate the plot, basically, because it's Judith Anderson, your eye goes to her. The whole film is cast like that, like John Carradine. And that's not just a tired old man playing Pharaoh. That's Sir Cedric Hardwicke, and he's very good. And he's very sympathetically written, even though the plot tells us that he's working the children of Israel to death. But at the same time, we like him.
Well, the city's being built and I'm winning this game, so don't interrupt us with trifles.
You lose the throne because Moses builds a city?
Casting Vincent Price as the builder, Baca, there's a lasciviousness to the character. He's always eyeing Deborah Paget, looking Deborah Paget up and down.
You are no man's slave. The hour of deliverance has come.
Not for me, Joshua.
John Derek, who of course became famous for A Lady That He Married, but was a magnificent actor, plays Joshua. He really holds up a large part of the film. He's terrific in that picture.
Is the holy mountain forbidden to men?
Yes, and I am afraid for him.
Yvonne de Carlo was the most wonderful, professional, delightful lady you ever could know. But I thought it was very strange casting. And I questioned the grandfather about it, and he said, no, I see something in her that is wonderful. It's up to me to get it. And she is magnificent as his wife.
Will my father free the slaves?
Prior to the Ten Commandments, I was an actor. I'd already been working, so there was film on me. But even though I had done work, I still went through the normal process of casting, with all the other little kids in town. We came to the DeMille gate, the casting door was right there, and I remember coming and there was hundreds of kids out there, and so I just got in line with everybody else. The process for casting my part was just a process of elimination. The first pass I made, and then the second pass, and then I had 2 interviews with DeMille.
Is it true that Egyptian girls paint their eyes?
Yes. Very few have eyes as beautiful as yours.
I had seen Samson and Delilah, and of course, The Greatest Show on Earth. I was in love with DeMille movies. And then when I was 15, my mother happened to take a friend of mine to Paramount because they were looking for 6 Daughters of Jethro. And she was auditioning for one, and my mother thought, gee, I have a daughter who looks kind of like this. And my mother did some fast talking to a secretary in the casting department and pulled out a wallet shot, and I got an interview. It must have taken, I think, 3 months from my first interview until the time when I could interview for Mr. DeMille. And I did my performance, my little reading, and then the door opened and in walked Mr. DeMille.
And I remember shaking hands with him and giving him a good firm handshake, as I was told to do. At one point, DeMille asked, would you mind if we took Eugene down to makeup and tried a skull cap on him? And so I was escorted down to makeup, and they put the skull cap on it, and it was really tight, and it was really hot. And I can remember I was walking between the stages, and oh, look, there's Mr. DeMille, and he was up in a window from his office looking down onto the lot. And so I looked up at him, and I went to wave to him, and I don't know what happened, but the circulation had been cut off or something, and I just went and passed out.
Mr. DeMille said, you have no experience in movies. You've never acted before. And if I give you this part, I'm going to be taking a big chance on you because this is a teenager and you're going to be the link with the teenagers in the audience. And he said, when you finish your rehearsal every day, I want you to come to whatever stage I'm working on and watch me make movies. You need to know how movies are made, and you need to know how I make movies. And the other thing, the other part of the agreement was, if I need to yell at you, I want you to give me your word that you will let me yell at you and it's not going to upset you. And I said, yes. And he said, will you shake? And I shook hands. And he said, okay, Lulua, then you've got the part. And he always called me Lulua, even after the movie was over. He always called me Lulua.
Even though I passed out from the skull cap, I don't think that was a reason for them to go without a skull cap. It just didn't look right. And so everybody's head was shaved. The whole shaving of the head for a little boy, it wasn't anything I looked forward to. But once I saw myself as the character in the movie, it was great fun. We started to learn the dance, and Ruth Godfrey choreographed it.
And in between the rehearsals, we would be called in to the costume department and wonderful Edith Head, Dorothy Jenkins, and we would get fittings, and they would be assigned to each girl according to our figure shape and the character of the parts we were playing.
The costumes are almost composites. Not one designer created the head-to-toe outfit. Mr. Freeburg did a lot of the paintings, John Jensen did sketches, and they took elements from each of those and combined them. So you had Dorothy Jenkins, who worked on the film, Dorothy had a fantastic reputation for being a stickler to historical accuracy. So it was a true collaborative effort. It was Arnold Freeburg, Ralph Jester, John Jensen, Dorothy Jenkins, and Edith Head.
I think that DeMille's attention to detail and his really overall big picture of the scope of what ancient Egypt was so true to life. And I think in order to really bring that to people, they really did amazing layers of research into every facet of life, including what kinds of skins and bags were used by the peasants.
We have the boards that were used for the fittings. The process was they would photograph the sketch that was done with notations by Mr. DeMille or by the costumer involved, and then that would go to the tailoring shop where they would start to construct the outfit. One of the costumes we have the records on took 5 months for Anne Baxter. So it was a long process.
DeMille greatly admired Heston. Heston was extremely bright. DeMille was very impressed with his intelligence, his knowledge, and the way he approached the role with great seriousness.
Dad thought that playing the role of Moses was both a challenge, a responsibility, and an honor. You know, Moses, he was not divine, he was a prophet. He was revered by, and still is, by 3 of the great religions of the world, which is quite unusual. It may be almost unique. He was, in the Bible, the only prophet to meet God face to face, whom the Lord knew face to face. That's what the scripture says. So I think all of those elements were going through Dad's mind when he was both preparing for this picture and, of course, later on when they went to Egypt.
Mr. DeMille always wanted to shoot in Egypt because he had to shoot here in Guadalupe for the first 10 Commandments. He knew that it was a chance of a lifetime. He said he wanted to shoot the movie on the very places where Moses and the pharaohs and the chosen people had trod.
So grandfather, myself, my little brother Joe, and my mother and father got on an ocean liner and went to Egypt.
Here in the historic harbor of Alexandria in Egypt, where the vessels of ancient civilizations once made their landfall, a luxurious ocean liner steams in to drop anchor. For Cecil B. DeMille had come to Egypt to keep an appointment with destiny.
When we got off that ocean liner in Egypt, the first thing he wanted to do was see the set, because the advanced man had been there and had built this tremendous set. We came around from the back, past the pyramids, went way past the set. I remember just getting goosebumps all over. You couldn't believe it. You couldn't believe it. It was so beautiful. And he was very pleased. And in back of that set was the commissaries, the horse stables, the wardrobe. Every piece of business was there, just like the slot at Paramount. It was all in back of those gates because extras had to be fed, they had to be watered. Their animals had to be watered for the Exodus. They had to have food. It was a huge city.
Mom and Dad were both going to go. And that was quite a trip in those days. It took 30 hours of air travel and 4 refueling stops to get there.
Lydia had been for more than a year doing a play on Broadway, but finally she realized that her entrance each night was being preceded by her unborn son, and so she realized she really had to quit. But she then looked forward to coming with me on the Egyptian location. But her doctor said no, she was too deeply into her pregnancy and it would be inappropriate and dangerous for her to go climbing around at Mount Sinai.
Dad had to go by himself, and he flew there, and he woke up the next day to discover the Great Pyramid of Cheops across the desert. And they gave him a horse to ride to the first location. They were still under construction, of course. DeMille arrives in his black car, and he opens the door, and he just stands there and looks at it for a while. And he turns to his assistants, and he goes, "Paint it." And Dad turns to one of them, and he goes,
"He's a pretty tough old bird, isn't he?" He said, "Oh, he's not so tough. He just expects a great deal, a very great deal."
Our trip to Mount Sinai was more than a motion picture making expedition. It was the climax of a great spiritual experience for all of us.
When they went to Sinai, it took them 2 or 3 days of travel by Land Rover just to get from Cairo to Sinai. And DeMille would stop every hour or so and scout out a little location to be shot on the way back. When they got to Sinai, they climbed the mountain like an expedition. They had a crew, they pared the crew down to about 10 guys, and they went on foot. They had porters, and they carried their own food and water. They had camps. They slept in sleeping bags. It was freezing cold at night. DeMille went miles off the road and climbed a mountain, and they ended up having dinner with the abbot of St. Catherine's Monastery, which is the monastery built to honor Moses and Mount Sinai. Dad had 2 ideas on Sinai, inspirations. The first was that he should come down from Sinai barefoot.
"Put off thy shoes from off thy feet."
Dad said to DeMille, "Mr. DeMille, I don't think he'd stop to put his shoes back on, having just met God." So he comes down barefoot. DeMille thought that was a good idea. And he also thought he would try on another, more risky idea, which he discussed with the abbot as well.
I said, "You know, Mr. DeMille, seems to me that if you hear the voice of God, you hear it inside yourself." I said, "I'd like very much to do the voice of God in the burning bush." And he said, "Well, Chuck, you've got a pretty good part as it is." But the abbot, fortunately, was intrigued by that. He said, "I think that's an interesting idea." So Mr. DeMille said, "Well, we'll see about that."
"Therefore I will send thee, Moses, unto Pharaoh."
But as it came to pass, I did get to do the voice of the burning bush. The voice reading the 10 Commandments was done by someone else.
Perhaps Chuck can tell you himself something of it, my taking him on the pilgrimage up Mount Sinai.
Well, I can only say in all sincerity that I've certainly never had a more challenging role in films than that of Moses, and I believe after the 2 months we've spent in Egypt that I could have had no more fitting beginning on which to base the characterization than to do the first scenes of the picture on the ground where Moses walked.
The day of the great Exodus scene. It must be one of the great spectacle scenes in the history of filmmaking.
At that moment, tens of thousands of people were being marshaled at locations that encompassed the map of Egypt. Herds of cattle, hundreds of camels were being assembled for the great mass movement of the Exodus.
They brought in fellahin and Bedouins and citizens of Cairo from miles around.
There are so many.
Dad arrives in costume and in makeup with the staff of Moses wearing the Levite robes, and he walks through 8,000 people to the head of the line. And as he walked through, he said the fellahin would whisper, "Musa, Musa, Musa," because they knew who Moses was. They may not have known anything about Hollywood, but they sure knew who Moses was. And he said it just made the hair stand up at the back of his head. And he gets there, and he doesn't look around. He stands out in the desert a little ways apart and waits for the shot and the extras and the animals to be ready.
The scene is too large for Mr. DeMille to start with the customary command of action. Only the bark of a gun could be heard by the vast throng.
And he turns around and he says to them, "People of Israel, remember this day.
When the strong hand of the Lord leads you out of bondage."
And he turns, and without looking back, he marches off into the desert and into legend. And Dad said at that point, he wasn't even thinking about acting. He was just being. He was just there. and they all followed.
The scene is filmed, and then the welcome and familiar lunch, 1 hour. Look at that stampede. Statistics on the food consumed, naturally, were of truly DeMillian proportion.
There's a famous story that happened supposedly during the Exodus. They had several cameras going, and the story goes that after the first take, DeMille turned to the first camera and said, "Well, what did you get? How did it look?" And the guy said, "CB, I'm so sorry. The film jammed in the camera. We didn't get anything." And he says, "Well, we have 2 other cameras." And he turned to the second one and said, well, how did you do, Fred?" And Fred said, "Well, it was great until an ox cart fell over right in front of the lens and we couldn't reset. We didn't get anything after the first 30 seconds. And he said, "Well, we still have the long shot." And he gets the megaphone and he calls up on top of the hill.
"What about you?" The guy said, "Anytime you're ready, CB."
I don't think it's true, but that's a good story.
During the Exodus, DeMille started going up the ladder that led to the very top, and the gates were 107 feet high. And Henry Wilcoxson was right behind him. And he said about halfway up, DeMille turned green, stopped, and started panting. It was obvious he was having a heart attack.
He's a 73-year-old man on location in Egypt with the most expensive movie ever made in Hollywood. What's going to happen if the director has a heart attack? One of 2 things. The studio has a replacement director out on the next plane, or worse, they shut the picture down and put in an insurance claim, and everything vanishes.
He never told anyone and told everybody that he had dysentery, because if the word got out he'd had a heart attack, it would have been disastrous for movie, publicity, everything. But he had a bad heart attack. The doctor said, "If you go back to that set, Cecil, you will die." And Cecil said, "Then I will die. But I have to be at that set." And he said, "You can't go." And my mother put her hand on the doctor's arm and said, "If he wants to kill himself, my father will kill himself." And they arranged, the doctor and DeMille, how to not work as hard as he'd been working, how to sit, how to make other people do it.
They had no problem knowing exactly what it was supposed to look like, how he wanted it, where everybody should be positioned, because they had all those paintings, they had all those watercolors.
Mother directed several scenes. Everybody pitched in so he could remain quiet. Of course, he was there and overall director. People stopped going to DeMille for decisions. They went to my mother for decisions. It just all went like some magic clockwork, just kicked in. But I think DeMille's life was shortened by the movie because of the heart attack, and then after that heart attack, never to be able to stop. He never rested. He would preferably die rather than stay home and not make films.
Arrival in New York from Egypt of veteran producer-director Cecil B. DeMille. He has been making location scenes for his new version of the 10 Commandments.
The long shots of the Exodus were obviously shot in Egypt. They spent weeks at Paramount later on getting closer shots of intimate action of actors, all the stuff that humanized the sequence and made the sequence more dramatic and more emotional.
My litter can carry him.
The fact that he called H.B. Warner in for the Exodus. That is so touching. He made King of Kings with Mr. Warner, and he loved him, like he loved all of his actors, but he loved Warner especially.
H.B. Warner, he was a very old man when they made the 10 Commandments, very frail, dying. He couldn't walk. The big man in the Exodus carried him. He couldn't remember the lines, so DeMille said, "Just say what you want. You know what you are, you know where you're going." And he said these wonderful lines.
"I am poured out like water. My strength dried up into the dust of death."
When we came home from the Egyptian shoot, then Mr. DeMille wanted to cut all the footage he had up to that point and see where he was, which takes quite a bit of time. And also they had some sets to finish and so forth. So I had time to do, I did one of my few comedies. It was quite good too, called The Private War of Major Benson.
I was the baby Moses, and here's how it happened.
Just before we were to leave to go to Egypt, Mr. DeMille said, Mrs. Heston, he said, I understand you're not going to be able to join us in Egypt after all. When do you expect your child to be born? And she said, in February. And he said, if it's a boy, he can play the part. And so our son was born in Presbyterian Hospital. He must have had someone planted in the hospital, because the first communication we had, I had barely picked up my newborn son when a telegram came saying, congratulations, he's got the part, C.B. DeMille. So he must have had that rigged, so if it was a boy, they could send that. And he got several $100s paid. Not bad.
So, indeed, I was cast. I didn't need much of a wardrobe fitting, but I showed up on the appointed day on the lot at Paramount, and they had the set of the Nile River rigged in one of the sound stages. The nurse who acted as the state-mandated social worker took me from my mother Lydia and brought me onto the set. And Dad was there in his bathing suit, just to supervise, I guess, and make sure they didn't drop me.
And she walked down to the end of the little pier, and I said, okay, I'll take him now. She said, oh, no, sir. She said, I have to have him all the time. And I looked at her the way I looked at Pharaoh, and I said, give me that child. And she did. And I put him in the basket, and he was doing fine. And Nina came in. Later on, I noticed the basket seemed to be sort of lower in the water than it had been. So the shot's a very quick shot. And I went over and opened the basket, and he was about 3 or 4 inches deep in water. It didn't matter to him, but could have had a different ending, though.
What kingdom has sent you? The kingdom of the Most High.
I remember doing the scene where Moses comes back from the desert. I can remember that like yesterday, because I just felt so regal. I mean, I was the prince. I think DeMille actually got a kick out of it. He would say, you're very proud, you're the king's son, you stand straight, you stand tall. And so when I walked up to Moses' staff, I wasn't afraid of him. And that was because DeMille said, you're not afraid of him. Your father's the king. You have nothing to fear.
My son, stand beside me.
Yul Brynner actually related to me, and that was very helpful in terms of creating that character, who I was, and because I was his son. Charlton Heston was absolutely remarkable in terms of being kind to me and enjoying me. He'd pick me up, he'd carry me. He was fun to be around.
I first met Mr. Heston when we were both in the makeup room at the same time. And because I was underage, we couldn't work more than a certain amount of hours. And Mr. DeMille was showing the rushes of the previous day's shooting to the other members of the cast. But I was not allowed to come in because of the limit of how many hours I could work. So Mr. Heston said to me, well, I get to see the rushes at lunchtime, and you and your mother can come with me, and that way you can see them. I mean, he was just so thoughtful. And so that's how my mother and I got to see the rushes. Just a wonderful man.
Oftentimes I would go to the set, and I would just gravitate right over to DeMille's chair. He had a PA system set up, and he would tell people, okay, so we're going to do this, or we're going to do that, So one day he just puts the microphone, he says, okay, Eugene, call quiet on the set, we're going to do a rehearsal. Puts the microphone right in front of me, and I go, quiet on the set, and say, we're going to do rehearsal, rehearsal. And so it just goes on for a little while, and Edward G. Robinson came over to DeMille, and he goes, Mr. DeMille, he says, this is kind of irritating, how this little kid calling quiet on the set. I do remember DeMille says, yes, Mr. Robinson, I realize how serious a film we're making, or something of that nature, And so Mr. Robinson walked away.
Tell Ramesses I'm coming back to my house.
Grandfather came home worried, and I asked him why, and he said that Edward G. Robinson was giving him a portrayal of Dathan that he didn't understand, and he was very worried about it.
Who am I to deny the word of the master builder?
And I said, well, Grandfather, why don't you talk to him about it? He said, I would never presume to talk to somebody as brilliant as Eddie.
What I bring is worth much.
I thought, that's very strange to hear, but that's DeMille. But when he saw Eddie's performance, he realized that it was the wicked humor that Eddie had brought to the part of Dathan that made it. Grandfather was elated about that performance. Eddie, you know, was blacklisted, and DeMille hired Edward G. Robinson, and in Eddie's autobiography, he said, DeMille saved my career.
You have not yet obeyed the Lord. Let my people go.
I love the plagues. I was so frightened when I first saw the movie.
Stretch out my staff against the waters.
With William Sapp, who was the person who did these special effects, with turning the Nile red, Bill Sapp is in the water. He had a garden hose. It had the dye in it. He pushed the garden hose right up against the wall that was containing the water. The staff goes down, pull the garden hose.
No magician's trick will set your people free.
He came up with the double-chambered pot, and so you start out with clear water, and then the second chamber kicks in and lets the red water out. My favorite thing, the hail. Popcorn. William Sapp, he says, I went up into the rafters with two of my guys, and he said, and we had a sifter, and he said, and we dropped it. Dropped it, dropped it, dropped it, dropped it, dropped it.
The people have been plagued by thirst. They've been plagued by frogs.
The scene that they shot, that Bill Sapp worked very hard on, that they shot that's not in the movie, is the frog plague. The frog plague consisted of hundreds of little rubber frogs that William Sapp made himself in the prop department.
And this was a daunting assignment to characterize the plague of the frogs. Much effort was built to construct these frogs that would then jump up on Ann Baxter's bed. It didn't work, and in spite of all the time and money expended on doing it, if it didn't work, he didn't want it.
And the only thing left is one of Bill Sapp's wonderful frogs. And he's falling apart, but he was indeed made for the movie.
I thought one of the most brilliant sequences is where the fog comes down from the sky and then splits, almost like snakes, coming down and then rolls on the ground. It was very difficult to do, to keep that low enough to film it like that. But it's very effective.
He's dead.
Me playing dead started well before I ever got on the set. They had decided early on they were going to make a wax figure of me. So she hands me off to him, and he goes and takes me. And I remember just laying there with my head back, and they would call cut. And then once you come back to the medium wide shot, that's the wax figure.
Mr. DeMille, he always had a lot of visitors to the set. Mr. DeMille loved an audience. And I can just tell you it was like Grand Central Station on that set.
When I was 9 years old, they showed Cleopatra by Cecil B. DeMille. I was mesmerized by this film. And out came Samson and Delilah, and there he was again. And I thought, I've got to write this man a letter. He's changing my life. And I sent him a letter, and it wasn't more than 3 weeks later, my mom said, oh, you have a... Such a great line. She says, oh, you have a letter from Paramount. It's in on your stepfather's desk. I opened this thing up, and, oh, this wonderful letter from Cecil B. DeMille himself, signed in his own hand. It was like he typed it out himself. I thought, all right, I want to go on the set of the Ten Commandments. So I called Paramount. They said, fine, come next Monday or next Friday at 10 o'clock. I couldn't believe it. So I took the bus into Hollywood, and I walked into the sound stage, and it was like stepping into the land of Oz. It was amazing.
A god of gold! A golden calf!
It was the set at the bottom of the base of Mount Sinai with the golden calf. When I met Mr. DeMille on the set, he'd been watching me the past 3 days or so. He said, "You seem to be here a lot." And I said, "Yes, but I could never be here enough."
Where could I bring you except to Egypt?
Where there is death?
No, where there's food.
The golden calf sequence, combined with the giving of the Ten Commandments, is a great example of the importance of juxtaposition in film. You have this marvelous kind of orgiastic scene of the golden calf and the bacchanalia and the wine, and it's sexy, and it's all these people dancing, and the music is going, and then you have God giving the law to Moses.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image.
There's always been this controversy about who dubbed the voice of God for the giving of the commandments scene on Mount Sinai. And various people said it was DeMille himself, but if you really listen to the thing, it's clearly not DeMille's voice.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
They tried everything. DeMille said they tried choruses, male choruses. They tried dubbing different actors.
Honor thy father and thy mother.
The actual voice of God was dubbed by a little actor named Delos Jukes, who shows up in a couple dozen films in the late 50s and 60s. He never claimed any credit for it.
The finger of God is really effective. Bill Sapp was behind the mountain, and he had the actual granite that he had brought from Egypt, and it outlined the words with gunpowder. When you see the words begin to flame out, that's Bill Sapp back there with his gunpowder, making it go off. And then you have John Fulton making the finger of God with the animation cells.
Get thee down, for thy people have corrupted themselves.
When we were doing that scene and the raucous orgies going on, now they'd do it naked. You couldn't do it naked yet, but you could come pretty close. And they were rolling around, and they did this for a couple of days. And of course, I'm not in the scene there. But one day, they were all having a great time the first day or so, but the third day it got a little old. And one of the girls went up to the first AD and she said, "Rusty, who do you have to get off this picture?" That's the best Ten Commandments story I know.
DeMille was probably the best director of extras that ever lived. He was brilliant at it. Whether it was 50 or 5,000, he knew how to deal with them. So he was giving his daily instructions to the extras. And in the back of the room, there was a couple of extras who were talking.
And DeMille took the mic and he said, "Those young ladies in the back with the green, yes, you miss, and the white robes. I notice you've been talking together. I've been trying to explain to everybody what I want in this next shot. Why don't you come down and tell us what you've been talking about?" And they came down finally, and she took the mic, and she said, "I was just saying to my friend, I wonder when that bald-headed old son of a bitch is going to call lunch." And of course, there was a huge laugh. And DeMille took the mic back and he said, "Lunch." See, so he won, really. It was a marvelous way to get out of it. No fool.
Principal photography was finished on the Ten Commandments August 13, 1955. The Ten Commandments did not premiere until the fall of 1956. That gave something in the neighborhood of 14 months of post-production, and they used every single day of it. The editorial department was working 16-hour days, 7 days a week.
Post-production is very difficult. Cutting a film of that size with that amount of film is daunting. But Annie Balkins, who was his editor for 40 years, I think, They got along so well and knew each other so well, and she would bite his head off if she thought he was wrong, and he listened.
By the time the 1950s arrived, and there were many special effects technologies that could be utilized, he was right there at the head of the pack, wanting to utilize these new techniques and technologies in his film.
Stone will break. There are 2,000 slaves on the ropes.
The lessons to be learned about filmmaking from Ten Commandments are everywhere. Just looking at the way things were crafted, even down to the early special effects that were talked about so much, you can understand sort of the history of special effects watching that.
DeMille said Gordon Jennings was the best special effects man he ever worked with. Gordon Jennings brought the temple down in Samson and Delilah. He did the train wreck in The Greatest Show on Earth. He was very good. But Gordon died on a golf course in 1953. Well, you've got this big special effects movie, so they got John Fulton, who was very good. He had done The Invisible Man for James Whale at Universal years before and done a beautiful job on it.
He did The Burning Bush, and the way he did it, he did a light effect that was done as they were filming it in the camera. Afterwards, in post-production, there were certain things that were animated in. For instance, the pillar of fire, and when the popcorn is dropped on Yul Brynner, then you see fire go shh. That was laid in afterwards. John Fulton, he was the one who was matching the Egyptian stuff with the American shots. He married those two pieces of film all through the movie.
Behold his mighty hand!
You're marrying the Red Sea that was shot in front of Paramount Studios in the tank.
The parting of the Red Sea has to be one of the great special effects sequences of all time.
DeMille's idea was that Moses calls upon God, God calls upon clouds. As the sequence begins, we see the clouds in the background, and with each successive shot, the clouds get a little closer together, and get closer and closer and closer together. And at the penultimate moment, they combine, move down, slam into the Red Sea, and divide the waters.
That was probably one of the most operatic scenes that DeMille did. The three women, you know, doing that. This total opera. But it's effective. It was filmed much like it had been filmed in the 1920s version, where you have this trough and then these tons of water come rushing down. Now you can run the film backward and they unfold.
We found the plates for it, and basically they just shot water at a tremendous rate until it sort of backed up and created this backwash. And then they shot it sideways. And that backwash is actually the wall of water that you see, you know, rising up out of the Red Sea. It's just a different perspective. And then they turned around and went to the other side of the B-tank out here at Paramount and did the same thing. Tilted it the other way, boom, you have another wall of water.
And then you have the actual studios, which is the marriage of two sound stages, an RKO soundstage and a Paramount soundstage that were back to back, and they broke the wall down. And so you have that long shot of everybody going down through the middle of the water. But if you had been on the set that day, they're walking down between two blue screens. They're not walking down between the water.
It's remarkable that they were able to put all those layers together. And it actually started with just a very placid shot of the Red Sea in Egypt. That's the basis for the shot.
One of the wonderful stories about the Ten Commandments and making careers was Elmer Bernstein. Victor Young had always done his scores, but Victor was ill and he was just not up to this. But he said, I have a young man, Cecil, that I think you'll like a lot. So he met Elmer.
He came to Hollywood in 1951, found some early success, and he did a picture called Sudden Fear, in which he did some unusual things in the score, at least by standards of that day. So his agent decided that this was maybe an interesting score that people should hear, so they arranged a screening and invited all the heads of music. Meanwhile, shortly thereafter, my father discovers that he's not very employable in Hollywood, that he's being named as a communist or communist sympathizer in the Hollywood Reporter. So he found work in other areas, among which he was a rehearsal pianist for Oklahoma. And then he got a call from a man from Paramount who said, I can offer you a 1-week contract. It is only for doing incidental music, songs and dances, but it's for a very big picture, the Ten Commandments.
What happened was DeMille needed some dances and chants and things which he needed to shoot to in the film. I was never going to be the person to do the film. The film originally, the music was going to be done by Victor Young, who had worked with DeMille before and had done the score for The Greatest Show on Earth. During the course of the shooting of the film, Victor became seriously ill and spoke to me on the lot one day. And he said, look, he said, I'll never be able to do this film. He said, if you have any way of getting to do it, go for it. He said, you won't be interfering with me at all. Ultimately, it was not I who made the representation, but it was the then head of the music department. He really liked the relationship that had grown up between DeMille and myself during the shooting of the film, because DeMille was not the easiest person to get along with. He was a perfectionist and demanded perfection at every level at all times. Roy just took a shot. He went to DeMille and said, do you think Elmer Bernstein might be the person to do the score for this film? And DeMille, in a very characteristic way, turned to Roy and said, do you think he could be another Wagner? And Roy said, I don't know about that. Well, he might be okay to do the score for this film. And so DeMille then called me into his office and he said something so really endearing. He said, do you think you could stand me for another 6 months? It was a joke, of course. And I thought that would be fine.
But he asked him if he was a member of the Communist Party, to which my father answered truthfully, no. And DeMille reportedly responded, well, that's good enough for me. I think the moral of all that is DeMille was a very practical person.
Let's talk about the creative process for a moment on the Ten Commandments. As I've said before, DeMille was a perfectionist. I played every single piece for him on the piano before it was orchestrated. So he heard every single piece of the score in advance. He was very canny, however, because I was a concert pianist and I could play these things in a very flashy and florid manner. And very often he would say, no, just play me the tune. Sometimes he'd say with one finger. But even so, he might change his mind when he heard the thing orchestrated and saw it in the film. And I would say about probably 30% of that score was rewritten after he heard it.
The exodus of the Jews coming out of the city, and it's a huge mass of people, and they're moving very slowly and ponderously. And my father's original theme for that was somewhat slow and stately. And DeMille said, no, I want it fast. To which my father responded, but I'm not going to match what's on the screen. Won't that be a mismatch? And DeMille said, no, if you write the music faster, they will look faster. And indeed, that's what happened. And he took that lesson with him. He mentioned it several times to me over the years.
I would say that the work on the Ten Commandments was singularly the most exciting project of my entire life.
DeMille called the public his best critics, and for the major preview for the Ten Commandments, he traveled all the way to Salt Lake City, Utah, to preview the Ten Commandments there. And he was asked by some people, why are you going to Salt Lake City to preview a film that has to pass the test of audiences all around the world? He replied, if the audiences of Salt Lake City, Utah like this film, I know that it will play anywhere.
Oh, Moses, Moses, you stubborn, splendid, adorable fool.
The response to the Ten Commandments by Salt Lake City audiences was absolutely overwhelming, as the preview cards attest. And it must have made DeMille feel so good that he couldn't wait for the film to get out in general release.
The New York world premiere of The Ten Commandments. From the cast of Paramount's VistaVision presentation, a $13 million classic which will be seen on theater screens for years to come, a who's who of great Hollywood stars. Charlton Heston, arriving with Mrs. Heston, enacts the role of Moses, from his youth to leading his people out of bondage.
When Dad saw his performance, essentially he said it was generally impressive, often quite good, but not quite what it needs to be. I think he felt that he was slightly underwhelming as Moses, that he could have been better, which is ironic because everyone thinks of that as being his iconic role, and it is, no question. It tells you a little bit about the nature of what sort of man he was. He always thought he could do better. As he said, DeMille may have expected perfection, but what he did expect was your best. And I think Dad did his best in that part.
Anne Baxter, seen in The Ten Commandments as Princess Nefertiti. Edward G. Robinson, who plays the treacherous overlord Dathan.
I remember when I went to the premiere, that was a big deal for me because I'd never been to a premiere of a movie, and they shaved my head again, and I went to the premiere, and I had a little, tuxedo, and had a limousine. It was great fun.
In the opening scene of Ten Commandments, DeMille walks through a curtain and presents the film on screen.
This may seem an unusual procedure.
But DeMille was DeMille, and he could do it, and he got away with it in a way that is not pretentious. It's wonderful. You go, oh my God, it's C.B. DeMille talking to me, his audience.
There will be an intermission. Thank you for your attention.
And he sets the tone. Then he goes through those curtains, and they start the movie up again. They start that music.
Bum, 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 bum. I mean, I would love that as a doorbell at my house.
You see the Paramount Mountain, except the Paramount Mountain has been repainted by Arnold Freeberg, and it's looking very much like Mount Sinai. And it says, a Cecil B. DeMille production, and that music behind it, and you are swept up from the very first moment.
And God said, let there be light. And there was light.
And DeMille's voice comes in from time to time as narrator, another unusual device.
Man took dominion over man. The conquered were made to serve the conqueror.
And it just works. It's hard to explain why. His voice doesn't take you out of the movie. It's just kind of charming and personal.
DeMille had been critically passé since about 1932, 1935, because he simply was impervious to changing tastes. His standing within the critical community was low, and the fact that he was immensely successful commercially also worked against him, because as we all know, nobody who really makes a lot of money in movies can possibly be any good. To his utter shock and amazement, the reviews on the Ten Commandments were very, very good. It was an enormous success. It cost $13.2 million. Its first go-around, it grossed $64 million.
I'm sure DeMille didn't expect the runaway success it was. And of course, around the world, it spoke to people, and it was one of the biggest international hits ever.
Grandfather took 10% of his own part of the movie and divided it up among the 100 people that had been so valuable to him. I've paid out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars and been happy with every check I wrote because of their hard work and their expertise.
He received millions of letters after the Ten Commandments was out there across America, across the world. And one of his favorite letters was the letter that said, "This movie made God real to me." That was his mission. That was his job. And that's what that movie does, and it's done it for me.
The Academy Award ceremonies that account for the films of 1956 must have been a real disappointment to DeMille. 7 nominations, 1 win for special effects was hardly the payback, I suspect, that Cecil B. DeMille expected, close to the close of his career. Cecil B. DeMille is a filmmaker who brought many gifts to the world, 70 feature motion pictures. But these are gifts that keep on giving. And that's one of the great things about this marvelous high-definition restoration, presentation of the Ten Commandments.
When I came here, there was a new emphasis on the importance of Paramount's history, which I was thrilled to be a part of, and thrilled to find out that one of the first restorations we were going to do was the Ten Commandments, because it so defines the history of Paramount Pictures in so many ways.
Man shall be ruled by law, not by the will of other men.
Of course, the story itself is timeless, and then the way he shot the film, all of the technical choices he made, shooting it in VistaVision, so you had that huge frame that could capture so much of the image, both technically and just sort of viscerally. So it simply is a much higher resolution and able to capture so many more rich, vivid colors.
It's a wonderful format because it's twice as big as a normal film frame, and it's also not anamorphic. There's nothing squeezed about it. It's just a flat surface, and you can get a lot of things in focus on a plane.
We scanned it at 6K resolution from the original camera negative, so we were able to capture exactly what was on the film back and represent it today in a way that it's really never been seen before.
Oh, Moses, build a city for him and said he will deny you nothing.
The other part of restoring the film itself, in addition to the digital restoration work of the actual film, we wanted to look at the other parts that made up the film and what was left.
Standing next to me right here is Martha Scott. This is the dress she wears when she puts Moses into the rushes. The dress is made out of a very lightweight burlap, kind of soft fabric, like a sackcloth. Right here we have the lovely Deborah Paget. This is a costume she wears when she's with Dathan. Now this is a crimped organza with a gold lurex thread that's woven into this. Behind me, we have Anne Baxter wearing the costume that she wears when we first meet Anne Baxter, the very flowy white silk chiffon, and that is real gold striping put into the fabric. And next to her is Nina Foch. That is the beautiful gold cape that is lined with a purple fabric that is what she wears when she goes to Yoshabel's home when the Black Death is creeping into the village.
The further we looked, the more we found just by opening up drawers and recognizing from the film the motifs of the jewelry and actually pulling it out and finding it.
The most priceless and my favorite probably are these 2 iconic pieces, the vulture headdress that Anne Baxter wore as Nefertari, and she wore with this piece, this golden pectoral, which is made up of 2,113 separate pieces. The greatest number of pieces that we have for one of the actors or actresses are the Anne Baxter pieces. But what we have is a cross-section of almost every single actor. We have on this end of the table this fantastic multicolored headdress, which is the Ethiopian king, and it's got a gorgeous green jewel in the center of it. And then all these beautiful fabric pectorals that you see here are all the Ethiopian nobles and dignitaries who came to the throne room to present their gifts and goods to the pharaoh. We have this one beautiful piece from Charlton Heston that is one of a pair of his arm bracelets, and you can still see that we have the fantastic original aging. Yul Brynner, we have one of his great arm cuffs, and it is gold-plated and it's gold leather lined, but sadly in our department when it was being rented, because all of this stuff again was in a working costume department, someone has rented it and painted it with silver spray paint. Edward G. Robinson, one of a pair of his gauntlets here, and this piece here, you see it's smaller than the other pectorals. This was the child's pectoral necklace that Eugene Mazzola wore as the son of Pharaoh when he was in the throne room when Moses first came back to see the royal family and demand that his people be freed.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
Certainly, Moses is one of the great figures in history, and it was a challenge to play it. I like to think I had some success in it, and it was very exciting to work on. I've played kings and cardinals and presidents and tyrants. Most of the time they get killed, but they're wonderful parts. And certainly Moses was one of the greatest. Wonderful part. This is a man that had a hand in creating a new nation, freeing a people, with a little help from God.
The whole film has a sense of this is something special. This is not mass-produced. DeMille's working in a commercial medium, but he's fine-tuning things to such a delicate extent. This is something really remarkable if you think about it. Because it's a handcrafted movie with a very specific political, moral, and social message, there's no comparison in terms of the emotional and artistic impact.
The movie's timeless because the story is timeless. Whether you're religious or not religious, or it doesn't make any difference. This story is a real story about an incredible man.
So let it be written.
This is the staff of Moses, which was a prop given to my father by Cecil B. DeMille on completion of the production of Ten Commandments. I suppose it's one of the most famous props in movie history. It's become a symbol. It's iconic with my father. When you think of my father being in Ten Commandments, you often see him holding this staff. I grew up with this staff. It lived in my father's study, and he was happy to have people hold it and take it out. It's obviously a treasured possession now, but it was a part of my childhood. We're standing here in the tank set at Paramount Studios, which was built for the Ten Commandments, where they filmed the famous parting of the Red Sea sequence. And in a way, it's kind of the spiritual home of my family. When my dad passed away, he left behind a letter for my sister and I, and made a request for us to pay our respects, to visit certain sites around Los Angeles that meant a lot to him. This was one of them. Paramount kindly cleared the parking lot for us so we could walk out and sort of say our goodbyes here. And this is where we are today. We're just honored to be here.